Hello, everybody. Thank you very, very much for joining us. Like I said, we're really grateful to have you tuning into this. And we think we've got a really good discussion for you to lend an ear to. And we're going to be talking about a number of bits and pieces about how you should plan your personal finance like you would your business and what the interaction is between the two. But the only place I can really start is by asking all of my beautiful panelists to introduce themselves. So James Beresford, over to you.
Yeah, so I'm James Beresford. I'm the head of wills and estate planning at BLM. I specialise in personal risk mitigation and obviously estate administration. I'll make sure you're looked after.
Awesome. John, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I'm John McCaffery. I'm a tax planner at Alexander & Co. I head up a team of a number of people over here. We specialise in advising entrepreneurs and family-owned businesses on all aspects of tax.
And Adam, would you mind introducing yourself, please?
Yeah, I am Adam Carolan, Managing Director of Xentum, a financial planning company. We specialise in helping people manage their wealth, but more primarily build financial plans, particularly business owners, which leads us on to today.
Thanks very much, guys. My name's Steve Kunsvich. I'm a partner at BLM, but my role in this isn't really important apart from being your moderator. And I want to be a moderator because we're having a discussion. We don't just want to lecture you today. And the reason it's so valuable to have everybody involved in this webinar that is because we want to give you a holistic overview of the topic that we're talking about. And the topic that we're talking about is arranging your personal and family finances as you would your business. So we're in a time of coronavirus, there's no getting away from that, and maybe it's a good time for us all to take stock of our own personal and business finance issues a bit more generally. And certainly COVID-19 is hitting very close to home. But I suppose if all of a sudden we're all anxious, we're all stuck in the house, are we any less objective? And if we're less objective, you know, what impact does that have on the importance of planning your personal situation like you would a business? I suppose it's easy to suggest that maybe one process is a bit less emotive than the other, or maybe the commercial blueprint gives us a bit of a better perspective. So taking that point, putting this to Adam first. Adam, where and how should business owners start when they're looking at planning their personal finances?
Okay, good question. So I think where we should start is just look at today where we are. So we've had 6-7 months to sit at home and think about, you know, where we're going as a family. It's been a difficult time. And I think where I prefer to start is to get business owners to take off their business hat and start looking at the whole picture. So I think the thing that I see the most is, you know, we build this business, we want a value from this business, and we're relying on that value from the business. At a point, we might sell it or exit in some way, and that's going to make us all happy, which is pretty much every business owner's mindset. I think what I'm looking to see is you know, someone taking a wider view and saying, is the stuff that I can be putting in place now? Can I get a plan in place? You know, what if I exit a business, what kind of income do I need? These sorts of questions, you know, is all about basically having a financial plan. But I think every business owner has a business plan and does that really well. Where I think they're falling down is they don't have a personal or family financial plan. And I think, you know, it's bringing that business mindset to the family and personal finances that I'm looking to see.
Talking about a state of mind rather than checklist.
Correct.
Excellent. On that, thinking about states of mind, John, so when you're planning on this, what kind of tax implications do we need to think about? I mean, we hear about loads of different kinds of taxes, inheritance tax, VAT, CGT.
And whatever you do, to be honest, there will be a tax implication of some way, shape or form. In terms of planning for your business, your future, the key point is actually that you work with your life in your plan. And following that, you wrap the tax around it rather than being driven by the tax, unless your sole goal in life is to save every penny of tax that you possibly can from going into the exchequer. You've got to live your life. Your wealth is either tied up in your company or you're making investments. Some of those investments will be likely to be subject to inheritance tax. Others aren't. For example, shares in trading companies, usually free from inheritance tax. You sell that company, you get an asset, cash, which is subject to inheritance tax. And my job when I'm looking at this is actually to work out what the people want to do with their lives and then help them effectively mitigate without constraining them in any particular way.
So again, you know, we might be looking at inheritance, we might be looking at CGT. I think again, it's maybe a state of mind and a way of thinking. Yeah, the tax is obviously certain. But James, from your perspective, what are we thinking about legally? Are we starting this process like a business would with the document in place? And does that come before a plan? Does that underpin one being made? Where do you start with all this?
Well, that's a good question. My role really is to implement the financial plan and the tax plan that Adam and John put together. And you wouldn't start a business without having a business plan. And in my view, when you're looking at your own estate and what legacy you want to leave, you wouldn't do that with an estate plan in place. And that's looking at all base of, in the worst case scenario, if I die, what's going to happen to my business interests, my assets, what's going to happen to my children? But also, what happens if I lose capacity? What's going to happen to the business? What's going to happen to my family? What's going to happen to me? So it's making sure that people are aware and understand the risk that they're taking on a day-to-day basis. And only once we know that, the three of us, we can put together the plan to ensure that ultimately everyone gets peace of mind.
I think, noting the optimism of the phrase there, if I die, thinking about, the three of us all being in the same room and a holistic approach, really. Adam, thinking about that approach, is it easy for your clients to divorce personal from business finance if they're working in a business as opposed to on a business? What's the first steps? What do they tend to get wrong when they're looking at it?
Yeah, so I call it the two circles approach. So if you imagine two circles, you've got a big circle, you've got a small circle. The big circle is the business, so that's where all their time, energy, focus, all their life is basically going into that business big circle. And there's a small circle over here that is basically their personal finance and the family circle, which if you think about it and you think about the reason you get into business, which is, to make yourself usually financially successful, to give yourself freedom, to give yourself a chance not to be controlled by anyone. If you think of those two circles, it's absolutely bonkers that the family and personal circle is a lot smaller than the business circle. It doesn't make sense to me. So, I think it's just aligning those two and putting more time and energy focus into the other side, which is the stuff that gets neglected. And there's no judgment there. What happens is, we at the moment, all our business owners that we're looking after are all focused at keeping a business running, which I completely get. But when we come out of this, and we will, I'm an optimistic person, we need to understand what are we doing it for, and it's not to run a business. Unfortunately, it's not to pay people's wages. It's to actually, enjoy life, as John said, and actually get something out of it.
So as far as that's concerned then, John, what kind of mistakes do we see from a pure tax point of view when we're looking at personal and family finances? Is it fundamentally different from business, or again, are we looking at some shared principles and concepts here?
No, it's quite shared. It's people don't plan early enough, and they don't take the advice early enough. So I quite frequently get people coming to me going, "I've done X," and I'm like, "That's expensive." Following on from that, though, if you get the advice earlier on, tax planning is all about knowing your options. So if you know what you want to do, and then tax is just another cost of your business, but it's also a cost of your life. Up to 45% on income tax, 40% on inheritance tax, 20% on capital gains. You might decide to play off taking a gain and sort of saving the inheritance tax. It might be you don't care about inheritance tax, but if you're not informed of what you do, you'll end up with a cost you weren't expecting, and that can hit into the net receipt you get from the various transactions, and that can massively impact on your plan for your life.
So, James, that's expensive. How do we use the law to reshape some of these decisions? What can we do to put that right from a wills, an LPA, or a tax planning perspective?
Well, what we would do is John quite correctly said, it's the early planning. Whether you are using lifetime trust to mitigate your inheritance tax position, you can do that at an early stage, and every 7 years you've got an opportunity to give away part of your estate for inheritance tax, whether it's making lifetime gifts, so potentially exempt transfers of cash. Then again, it's looking at the will perspective to ensure that, most people, I use the word if we die, obviously two guarantees, life, tax and death. People still don't think, it's not going to happen to me. But we've seen in the past 9 months, it's happened to people we didn't expect. So it's putting a will structure in place that will not only cover you now, but will cover for the next 5 years. And then we review that in 5 years' time, just to ensure it still does what you want it to do. Unfortunately, we see a lot of clients who have the will think they want, rather than the will that they need to cover their individual circumstances. And I think that can be that's a problem really from the misconception in society about what wills and estate planning and tax planning entails.
So I suppose that goes to apathy or maybe being a bit overwhelmed by it. I mean, do you still, we hear that people, and this is one for everybody really, don't want to make a will because it's too hard. Do we still see a lot of that? Is that changing because of COVID-19, or is that still kind of where we are?
I see this on the coalface every day. It's misinformation. People they don't understand the law. They still have the concepts of, it's a common law spouse. He or she will get everything. And that's not the case. And unfortunately, because wills can be seen as quite a cheap commodity, people forget that, actually the will to me is a free output of the advice. And the only way we can advise is actually getting under the bonnet to spend time with them to discover what the hopes and dreams are of that person, to understand what they want them to achieve, and then we can design and execute the process. And we can only do that by working with Adam, working with John, so you get the full collaborative approach, because ultimately that's what's best. People pay £15 for an online will. When it comes to this, you pay for what you get.
So the overarching message being, if you think it's expensive to hire a professional, wait until you hire an amateur or don't hire anyone. So John, from your perspective, thinking about what do we think the big tax issues are then when we're looking at structuring a business and how we plan for the future? Zooming out of this, what do we need to be looking at?
Structuring a business, structuring your personal. Basically, the structuring a business, in most of these circumstances, the business is the main asset. From a tax point of view, that falls into one of two categories. It'll either be an investment business, and put very simply, that means you've invested in assets that you hold for the long term and you make a return off them, or it'll be a trading business. You buy, sell goods, you provide services. Okay. From a capital gains point of view, there are certain reliefs available on the trading business that aren't available on the investment business. But at the moment, it sounds a lot, but capital gains rates are okay in terms of things being around about 20% for people. Those businesses then, and this is the playoff, you always get a playoff generally between capital gains tax and inheritance tax. If you keep an asset, then you won't have a capital gains tax charge. But you may have an inheritance tax charge. That's if it's an investment type asset. As I said, certain trading assets benefit from a relief known as business property relief. And for certain people, keeping that trading asset till they die is an effective way to tax plan. But it might not be great for the business. So you've got very old shareholder holding 100% of the business, stifling growth in the business. So it could be that they actually moving it on earlier and doing some effective investment with Adam, getting your will in place with James, could suit your life better and still be tax efficient. But it's always, from a tax point of view, a playoff generally between capital gains tax during my life or inheritance tax on my death.
So James, in terms of that dynamic, where does legal advice fit into that discussion?
Well, really, it's much like John said, it's looking at the tax planning elements of it, because whilst one should never let the tax tail wag the dog, you're able to look and see how the client is best off, and whether we're using, say, for example, a business property relief, whether there's an opportunity to put assets that get business property relief in trust during the lifetime, so there can be a modicum of control from the business owner, so they would be the trustee but not benefit from the trust. Or you look at it and say, well, with trusts are great because you can hold over any capital gains into it. So it's looking at the planning perspective. So we will structure it on the basis of taking the tax advice and then looking at the overarching financial plan. Because yes, once you start making the gifts, you can no longer benefit from it. So it comes really over to Adam, because you need, you work hard, you build your business. You're not doing it for love, you're doing it for your lifestyle. And yes, you can give away all your assets and not pay the inheritance tax, but then it comes back to your lifestyle. And that's where the wraparound financial plan.
So thinking about that wraparound financial plan then, Adam, I mean, obviously there's certain tax rules that you're going to need to stick to, but we're talking about with business owners about pivoting quite often. Is it easy to pivot your personal financial planning the same way you would your planning for a business?
Yeah, well, let me take you through how I would do it, and I'll just give as much value away as I ever would on a webinar. So, if you're a business owner, you would have a balance sheet. So there's no reason you wouldn't have a balance sheet from a personal perspective. It's just a spreadsheet, assets, liabilities, income, outgoings. So you look at that in simple terms and you start there and think, how much am I worth right now? What assets do I have? What liabilities do I have? What income is coming into the household? What's going out of the household? So that's some very simple things you can do. And then you can forecast forward using that same mindset to say, okay, if I need a certain amount of income at a certain date, let's use example, £7,000 net, because we all want net income. We don't, forget the tax. We want to know what's coming in our bank on a monthly basis. What assets do I then need to build in the background to produce that net income? So as John said, that might be an investment company that you hold. It might be exiting a company that you own. It might be some ISAs. It might be pensions. The key is to forecast what income you're going to require. And then as a business owner, go out and build those assets, either through your business or personally, that's going to give you that income for the day that you're going to say, look, I've had enough. I don't want to, work in the business, or, I want to go and do this. You can only have that flexibility if you built the assets in the background. It's all about the assets.
So having said that, then think about those assets. Most of the people on this webinar are going to have a variety of business and personal assets. So John, from your perspective, what's the interaction between them? How do you manage that from a tax perspective?
Two ways. You're looking at one, annual income they require and how to get that to them in the most tax efficient manner. And that would be a combination of, say, potentially dividends, income spread between households where possible. Certain family businesses can have shares with family members, allowing them to pay dividends out to those family members. From a longer term, and you're kind of starting, sort of depending on the level of wealth, but I would start sort of 40s, looking at the spread of assets you've got. So can you start making gifts into trust? Have you got the income to be able to make gifts into trust? What sort of investment? So a lot of people, I deal with a lot of property, a lot of landlords, and they are storing up an inheritance tax problem for themselves. Debt reduces that problem by reducing the value of what they own. Yeah, it's very much tailored to each and every person's individual circumstances. So what we do is we basically get an understanding of where they are, where they're at in their life, what the spread of assets they own are, make them aware of what their liabilities would be, and factor in what income they're going to need and what level of control they will need for the rest of their life. Yeah. And then plan accordingly with things like keeping hold of your trading business if you can. If you're going to sell it, maybe using some trust structures. If you have surplus cash, think about gifting it or investing it in assets that qualify for business property relief. We give the advice and it gets passed over to the other guys here to implement it. So James puts a legal framework around it. Adam gets the asset classes to invest in.
So thinking about that legal framework, James, obviously people all have tuned into this to maybe talk about wills and lasting power of attorney, that kind of thing. Is this all they should be thinking of, or are they looking at their articles of association? Are they looking at some other documents? What kind of wider legal issues do we need to be looking at here?
The main things that we need to be looking at, Steve, would be the wills. Everyone should have a will. In my view, it's negligence, personal negligence if you don't have a will, especially if you have children. Powers of attorney, again, that is extremely important, because I've dealt personally with times when business owners have been incapable of making decisions without powers of attorney in place, and an application has to be made to court to deal with their affairs under a deputyship. And in the last case I dealt with, unfortunately, the sale of the business fell through, and then the chap died. So it was the worst of both worlds, really. And so they're the main things. We've got trusts, look at your trust planning, so getting those in place. And also, you're quite correct, looking at the articles of the company to see how it all looks, looking at cross-option agreements, key man life cover, although that's something that Adam would really be dealing with. But when it comes to this, it's bringing in the specialisations. So, in respect to the articles and cross-option agreements, I'll be looking at one of our colleagues, Danny, to deal with that advice, just to make sure that everything is boxed off. So ultimately, once someone's been to see us, they get that peace of mind knowing, right, for my personal life, I have ticked that box, I am happy for it. And then we keep that under review for the next 5 years.
So in terms of ticking that box then, in terms of where these assets go, Adam, how do you look at the interaction between these business and personal assets from an IFA's point of view? Does it all go into one pot?
No, I mean, we look at it as a whole. So, because of the way we charge, obviously we're a fixed fee financial planning business. We charge people to manage their whole wealth, and we include the business in that. The business is usually the biggest asset, as John said, of a business owner. So, the idea of not putting that in the financial plan, not having a valuation that you're forecasting, not having an idea of what you do with that, it is just wrong, in my opinion. It needs to be factored in. Obviously, John would do the tax piece. We would look at and discuss the various structures that someone would potentially want to have. So, we have some clients that like to have buy-to-let portfolios. We have some clients that just like simple stocks and shares. We have some clients with multiple business interests. It's whatever the client wants to own and what they feel comfortable with. I'm never going to take them down a route that they don't feel comfortable with. What's the point in that? So there's a whole conversation there about structuring the assets. At the end of the day, all I care about is, are those assets going to give them the income they want to give them the lifestyle that they're asking for? That's all I care about. If that's solved, I'm happy and the clients are happy.
I'm going to take the next point in reverse order because I want to save James's epic answer to this question for last. But when we're thinking about that planning, Adam, where does a will come into this? What's the importance of a will from your perspective as part of this planning process?
Well, the will for us is just a minimum, as James says. So, we wake up every morning, we're all the same. We have to understand risks and opportunities. So, my experience that people are not willing to look at opportunities and go beyond that thinking until they've addressed the risks. So, first part of our job and all of our jobs is to address the risk and make sure, they're covered. So you might have insurance, you might have wills are absolutely crucial, powers of attorney. We all know, having worked with similar clients, that if something happens, we're usually the people that get left to pick it all up. And it's devastating. So it's not expensive. Get the risks addressed, and then you can start looking at the fun stuff, which is the opportunities. Once that's the bit that we all enjoy, in the job.
So the opposite of an opportunity is obviously a risk, and I'm going to get on, don't worry, James, to talk about personal risk in a moment. But John, from your perspective, if you're planning a will early, is there an advantage from a tax point of view? Are you brought in when they're being written, or is there a specified point in drafting that where you step in?
So to be honest, a will's a pretty critical document in terms of the planning. It implements the planning we would put in place. As part of a suite of documents. So you mentioned before articles and shareholders agreements and that kind of thing. They are similar, and I would most definitely have a review of those if I was looking to do some tax planning from a business and a personal point of view. As I say, the will is a really, really serious piece. It's a protection piece, and it's a peace of mind piece. It's if I've implemented some planning around what happens on a death, it needs writing down somewhere. It's not valid, and that's what the will does.
So I can see him straining at the leash here. James Beresford, what problems can occur if a business owner doesn't make a will?
Well, the main problem is that people will encounter is that they spend all the time building up this business. The business is their baby, and then they don't make a will. And if you don't have a will, you have no say as to who inherits your estate. And I'm actually stealing this. They compare the laws of intestacy to giving a toddler a carving knife. It's probably going to be all right, but there's potential for a lot of damage. If I can remember who told me that quote, I would credit him, but I can't. But it's quite right. I've seen, unfortunately, many businesses being torn apart because of the laws of intestacy. and say 3 sons or 3 children suddenly becoming equal shareholders. One of them's got a raging drug habit. One of them's an alcoholic, the other one's a playboy. And the business that the father built so hard to build is completely destroyed. So by putting this in place, it offers that protection. And what we find is people, they don't understand the risks. And it's only once we've sat down and, well, on the suite of risks that we all face, where do you stand? For example, for married couples or couples in a civil partnership, are you that bothered if the survivor of you remarries or forms a new civil partnership? Or are you happy to take the chance? We're seeing litigation coming through now where second time around marriages and the children from the first marriage are being disinherited by the new partner. And that all can be negated by taking proper planning. And for me, it's important to sit down with people to say, what's important to you? What are you wanting to achieve? And only once we've done that can we advise, and that's complementary with John and Adam. It's the same conversation. And I think it's a failing of the industry because will writing is unregulated, that people don't actually ask them questions. It's seen as the tick box exercise, but it's a fundamental document that underpins all this. It's what happens to you at the end of the day, and then everything else gets built around that. And it's I probably have every time I see a good client, they'll say, "I feel so much better. I've got peace of mind knowing we've signed this, and knowing in the worst case scenario, my family, my children are looked after."
Told you it was going to be epic, and don't worry about litigation, James. We're getting there. But moving on from that, John. So we've got a will in place.
Yeah.
How do we vary that will? What are the tax benefits of varying a will after death? And how do you go about doing that? Is it as nightmarish and a black art as it appears to be?
No, it's a legal process. It's a relatively simple process. It's basically within 2 years of the death, if the beneficiary under the will wishes to alter that will, they can alter that will with limited tax consequence. It's effective for inheritance tax purposes. It's effective for capital gains purposes. There's a slight complication, but it's a manageable one with income tax. The beneficiary, the original beneficiary, is deemed to settle the change on the new beneficiary. But with planning, there's no reason why actually you can't vary the will and actually improve the tax position if it's not been looked at correctly before death.
So from that perspective then, James, what can you do if you're going to vary will? How do you do that? How do you reapproach this whole issue without walking yourself into a very bitter dispute?
So if you wanted to vary a will, what you look at is the deed of variation. It's that beneficiary choosing what they want to do with that asset. So it's that individual choice. If you take an appropriate planning, one thing you can do is use a discretionary trust on death. And within 2 years, once the dust has settled, you can appoint out of that trust, and that in effect rewrites the will. So you can see how the land lies at that stage. But it's important to ensure that you don't do it too quickly because there's actually a legal track there. But it's important to know that the client is looking after their legacy and what they want to do.
Can you explain a bit about lasting powers of attorney and when business owners should be thinking about putting them in place?
When they turn the age of 18. Basically, obviously people will say, well, you've got to say that's what you deal with, but we will either be instructed by people, younger people when it's too late, or old people when it's too late. All it takes is slipping on a tram track, banging your head, falling down the stairs as my sister did this week, a collapsed rugby scrub, or unfortunately my best friend 2 years ago had a stroke. Who's Mr. Fit at 40. This can happen at any time. And if you have it in place, you choose who you would like to look after you in that event. It's protection. Everyone should have it in place. Unfortunately, 90% of the adult population haven't done it, don't consider it because it's not important. And to me, that actually befuddles me.
But again, if people are reluctant to put a will in place, does that explain why are LPAs just not more widely known? Does that explain reluctance for them as well, or is it kind of the same issue?
I think everyone thinks they're invincible, and it'll never happen to me. And unfortunately, it does. And when it comes to death, it will. It comes to us all. I'm sorry to be so grim on a Thursday afternoon, but by putting it in place, you retain control beyond your capacity. And you will have peace of mind knowing, for example, that someone you trust can look after your financial affairs, can still use Adam to manage your financial affairs. You know, if you don't have that in place, it goes to court, it takes about a year, and the person who's appointed to look after you may not, well, probably won't be the person you want to look after you, and it may end up being a solicitor.
So moving on with the theme of invincibility, very appropriately going back to Adam. Adam, what kind of planning opportunities do you think there are for business owners in their wills? You know, how do they plan their legacy from a financial perspective within a will or a lasting power of attorney?
Yeah, I mean, the will's an interesting one. Pretty much, you know, we believe in tailored wills. So we believe in, you know, being specific to what that person wants. We don't entertain off-the-shelf wills. I think the idea is for business owners, they're used to being in control, and a good will is their way of controlling things if they're not around, which I think is crucial. You know, it seems such a waste, and obviously I've been through this personally, I'm not going to get into it today, but it seems such a waste for someone to spend so long building up an asset and for them not to do a piece of simple paperwork to control it if they're not here. You know, and again, I don't think it's people not wanting to do it. I just think it's inertia. It's not top of mind, and it's difficult to do sometimes. But you know, I guess we're here today to say, look, just spend a bit of time, get it in place, and you don't have to think about it for probably 3 to 5 years.
So having said that, I mean, we as lawyers, I think we'll very often come across a situation where the accountants bring clients to us because either John or Adam are normally the first person they go to. So John, from your perspective as the trusted advisor, what do you think the opportunities are for mitigating your tax position? I know we talked about it already, but specifically with wills, what do you think the planning opportunities are for mitigating your tax liability within a will?
With a will, I mean, it's very circumstance specific, but I mean, one of the easy ones, for example, is transfers between husbands and wives are free of inheritance tax. So a will that transfers an estate to a wife, or the other way around, potentially buys you time in terms of inheritance tax planning. You can, if, as James mentioned before, you're concerned about your legacy and your estate going to a remarried spouse. In those circumstances, you can create a trust on death, whereby your former spouse has an interest in the income of that trust, but the capital is protected and later goes to your kids. Yeah, there's lots of variations depending on the circumstances. Those are the most common I come across.
So James, from a legal perspective, we're talking about tax mitigation there, yeah? And then how can we use the levers of the law to help a business owner plan their legacy through a will, for example?
Well, I'll be really repeating what John's just said, in his very erudite response, in that the spouse exemption is a great opportunity. There's no inheritance tax between spouses, and I'm a great fan of using the life interest trust because what it does, it actually allows, if drafted correctly, I will hasten to add, it makes it sound simple, saying, oh, just use the life interest trust, but there's many variations on that theme. But to properly bespoke the drafted life interest would enable, say, for example, the surviving spouse to actually give up interest in that trust fund during their lifetime. And that allows them to make a potentially exempt transfer, which gets the 7-year clock running. So if there's a younger spouse, or maybe a spouse a bit more healthy, you're able to do some more post-death tax planning. And it can even work, if it's correctly drafted, if the spouse has lost capacity, that the trustees, as long as that spouse doesn't need the money, it's not affected them, the trustees could appoint out of the trust fund. So the beneficiaries, and that 7-year clock runs again. So there's some great opportunities. Another one that can be used is taking advantage of business property relief. So as John's quite correctly said, if there's an interest in a trading business, you get the 100% relief. You could set up a trust in your will that covers your shares. So that means that the trustees would manage the shareholding rather than it maybe going to the children who may not be able to manage that responsibility.
Insurance as well, James, couldn't it? You could use insurance to buy yourself time. So if you're not ready to do it for the next 10, 20, 30 years, give assets away, set up trust. A simple way of buying yourself time is just to get some decent life insurance in place within a trust. Is that fair?
I think insurance is extremely underrated. I think it for me, whilst I'm not allowed to give that advice, I'm sure you agree, Adam, that everyone should get the insurance in place without shadow.
That's a phrase I want to seize on. You're not allowed to give that advice. There's three of you in this discussion. Do we think, and it's a bit of a fundamental question, we are going to leave some time at the end of the webinar for questions, so if you do have one, please do leave it in the Q&A bar. But just as a fundamental point, we're all approaching this holistically. Do we think, round the table if you like, that there's a problem maybe with advisors holding on to more of these issues than they should? Do we think that advisors in this sector act holistically, work cooperatively for the benefit of the clients, or if everybody's chasing the same fee, are they holding it a bit too close to their chest?
Shouldn't be the same fee. I mean, from my point of view, chartered accountant, I'm specifically prohibited from giving investment advice. I know where my job starts and ends, and I know where it needs passing on. If you pass it on to the right people, you're adding value to your client and therefore increasing your fee base. You're not damaging your fee. If advisors are trying to hold on to that part of the relationship or control it, maybe they're introducing to the wrong people, because actually there is a key thing in there. Actually, you only introduce your clients to people you trust, which is a big thing. But no, you absolutely should know what the limits of your job in this situation, because it can go horribly wrong if you don't.
So bathing in the warm fuzzy glow of that answer, Adam, what's your take on it?
My experience is working with great professionals adds a huge amount of value, and I think most clients prefer to have a good team around them, not just one individual. So I mean, John and James, we all work on the same clients. We know where our boundaries lie, but we're often agreeing but also challenging each other, which I think helps as well. So if I've got an idea that John doesn't necessarily agree with, we'll talk it through and we'll come to the right outcome for a client. I think that adds a huge amount of value.
James, follow that, challenge that, if you will. What's your view on that?
Well, I think the roles of the advisor, imagine a Venn diagram of the three circles meeting. The best bit of advice is the bit in the middle where we all cross over. And really just to add on to Adam's point, John, Adam and myself do work on a lot of clients together. And the great thing is none of us have an ego and we don't take offense. As long as the client gets the best advice at the end of the day that works for them, that's what's important. I think there can be a risk where people plough their own furrow and think, this is what we're going to do. When a business owner is looking at it, they need to build the right team that will work together for your goal. It's like when you're building the team in the business. You want to build the right team to grow the business, and it's putting that right team around yourself.
They're not getting away from big, scary existential questions then. I've left a bit more time to these because I think they're a bit more complex. Adam, from a financial perspective, how do business owners get the most out of their business for the benefit of their family? How do they make that business work for their personal situation?
What do you mean, the successful ones?
Well, ideally, yeah. But if you horror stories are every bit as
I mean the successful ones. So from my perspective, get a financial plan. I would say that because I'm biased. I'm a financial planner. But if you have a financial plan, put it in your business plan. If you're not running your business for the benefit of you personally, I'd ask, what's the point? What's the purpose of that business? So I think the ones that really understand either have a timeline or a number or an objective in mind with their business, and they're really clear on what their business achieves. Why I think business owners are differently is because they've got control usually over growing that asset, which is completely different to an employee who doesn't have control over the business. So I think the successful stories and clients that we've had have controlled the business to a certain point where it gives them all the financial freedom they need.
John, again, financial freedom and tax don't easily go hand in hand, although hopefully we've dispelled a lot of that myth. From your perspective, from a tax point of view, how do you help business owners get the most out of their business for their family?
So tax is a cost, right? And it's a really simple example. Everybody talks in terms of the kind of gross income, right? So if we had our salary, we talk about, say, earning 50K. You earn 50K, but actually you've got about, let's see, 28 to take home. Sorry, 28, 38, something like that. Bad maths, that's really not good. However, let's say you've got one individual taking 100 grand dividend, or two individuals in a household taking a 50K dividend each. The one individual has got about 65, 70K. The two individuals taking 50K have got 94K, right? It's knowing your tax costs so you can actually plan your net income.
That's really insightful. James, from a legal perspective then, where does a lawyer fit into this idea of making the business work for a family?
Well, it's really making sure that everyone's protected. You know, I look at it purely from a protection way of making sure that kids are looked after, surviving spouses are looked after, and ultimately that the business owner gets what they want. You know, as I say, it's putting the framework in around some of John's and Adam's ideas. You know, and that's really where, by getting the three together, that's where it really adds the best value.
Definitely. So on to our main, we have got some questions actually that we're going to get to in a minute or two, but the big issue then, I suppose, the one that underpins all this discussion, Adam, you've always said, as long as I've known you, that business owners need to think differently about their own finances than anybody else does. Why is that?
There's a number of reasons, but mainly it's around energy and focus. I think, you know, the business owners that I see and speak to in our clients put so much energy and focus. I mean, if you look at the last 6 to 8 months, and, you know, we're all massive fans of the business owner community. We believe they power the economy, as they do. Just think about how much energy these guys are putting into the business over the last 6 to 8 months, keeping them afloat. What I don't want to see is that bill and then not to do the plan on the other side. It just breaks my heart to think about that, because obviously I've seen that disaster scenario. So, you know, they need to do these plans on the other side, because then I'd ask, what's the point? You know, if you're not doing that, what is the point?
But John, from your perspective, with your tax hat on, you know, what's your view on thinking differently about personal as opposed to business assets?
You should treat them the same. It's all, from my point of view, it's about the net position. It's the after-tax cost and what your priorities are. So as I said right at the beginning, work out what you want from life and wrap the tax planning around it. But in doing that, make sure you know you've got the information to make informed choices.
And to a person I ask regularly what he wants from life, James, legal perspective, how about from what's your view on this question?
Well, people don't know what they don't know. And, you know, going back to John, it's learning, finding that information out and making sure it's all mitigated. You know, when you're building a business, you're working hard for it. And I can't see why you'd want to work hard for it and not to put the plan in place so that you, your family, and whoever else you want will benefit it from it ultimately.
So we're going to wrap up in a second or two and then open the floor to questions. Just if you could leave everybody from this discussion, or that's listened to this discussion, with one piece of advice. Adam, what's your first point to raise as far as that goes?
Yeah, really simple. Think about assets. So think about what assets are going to give you the income in the future, whether it's in 5 years, 10 years time. You know, start to visualize and also start putting plans in place about what those assets will be.
So is this a mood board that changes? Is this a document that we refer to? What does that plan look like?
Yeah, I mean, we have a tool on our website we call Asset Builder, which lets you play around with figures. But basically, it's just, you know, just write down what the net income you think you want is, and then do a bit of forecasting about what assets will give you that net income. John's absolutely right. You know, the only thing you should care about is net income, because that's what goes into your bank, that's what you spend. So just start playing around with that. I think if you start visualizing at what that looks like, the actions off the back of that exercise are really, really good in my experience.
So John, you are absolutely right. But from your perspective, being absolutely right, what absolutely right point do we want to leave people with?
It is the two, and it's exactly the same answer as I gave to the question before. It's wrap your tax planning around. In business, I'd call it commercial, but it's actually wrap the tax planning around your life, not your life around the tax planning, and get the information you need to make informed choices.
And for the last word, James, how about you?
I think for me, there's two. One's a cliche, and the other one I actually properly do mean. The first one is fail to prepare to fail. You need to get that plan in place. And the main point for me is do it. Just do it now, because there will be that day when it's too late to do it.
I hear do it now, and I'm not going to bust out an old Schwarzenegger impression because we have questions from the floor. So firstly from Ben in the chat, Ben says, I am asset rich and have limited liquid assets. If I want to set up a trust for my children, what's the best way to transfer £300,000 or so into a trust from my main family residence without having to sell the property?
Ooh. Main residence?
Good response, John. What are you
main residence. So main residence is a little bit tricky. Because it's his main residence, he can transfer it in without a capital gains charge, right? And because it's a gift, there shouldn't be any stamp duty land tax charge, so it's fairly efficient. Now the problem with it is, if he's doing it for inheritance tax purposes, there's a nasty little rule called gifts with reservation of benefit. So if he's transferred it in and still has full use, it still falls in his estate. So the way around that is he has to pay a market value rent then to the trust for the use of the property.
Okay. James, do you want to pick that one up?
I concur with John. If there's an additional benefit, that's always going to be the one that's going to catch you out on it. And then that's when you've got to really, in your head, work out, well, am I happy to have made this gift and then have to pay rent to use my own house after I've made the gift? So,
Adam, anything you want to add on top of that?
No, I mean, I think John's right. I think I've seen it quite a few times, only successfully a couple of times. I think it's quite a big call depending on the life stage to do it. I definitely wouldn't be thinking about doing it too early in life. It's what I generally see later in life. I don't know what the other guys think on that, but it's not something that I would be inclined to agree with, fairly early on.
There are much better assets to put into trust than your main residence.
Yeah.
And from an inheritance tax point of view, depending on the size of your estate, your inheritance tax free allowance, the nil rate band is called, gets extended for your main residence. So actually, you might want to look at other assets going in rather than your main residence.
That's excellent answers, guys. We have another, my word, we have 3 questions now. So moving on to Daniel's. I'm a slight novice. Now this kind of strays into corporate really, but I'm a slight novice to this area. How does one set up other shareholders in a business on a tier 2 shareholding so they can get dividends through this route?
Right. That's very, very much circumstance specific. Okay. So it depends who the shareholders are he wants to bring in, and for what purpose he wants to bring them in. Okay. If he is transferring shares or current value of the business to other shareholders without them paying for it, there's very likely to be an income tax charge on those shareholders. Okay. There are mechanisms, so certain option schemes, which is a grant of a right to buy a share in the future. For employees, there are certain tax efficient ones like the EMI you can put in place. For non-employees, and you wouldn't do this very often, they're not particularly tax efficient, but you can have things like unapproved options. Or there's a certain mechanism known as growth shares, and trying to explain that simply, you basically freeze the current value of the company. So say it was worth 5 million, and those shares would only share in value on an exit above, say, 5.25 million, and that limits the tax exposure on the issue.
The objective's the key there, though, John, isn't it? So it's all, once you know the objective, then you can go and get the advice. So, EMI scheme is probably the simplest, isn't it, of all those, and probably the most used.
It's sufficient by a mile.
Yeah. But that is almost always dependent on an exit. Not always, but the objective of the business is absolutely crucial, I think, when you're looking at share schemes.
This is starting to sound like a sequel. James, were you about to say something there on this point, or?
I will concur, my learned friends.
Everybody's having their "I agree with Nick" moment here, aren't they? But moving on to I think what's going to be our last question, given the time we're on, given that everybody's going to need coffee after. Oh no, we have another question. My word. Johnny says there was some mention of holding on to the company for tax reasons. Are there any downsides to a company sitting dormant if it's not actively trading?
If the company is not actively trading, I mean, it depends why the company is there. If it's not actively trading, then it doesn't qualify for the relief I've talked about, which was business property relief. So business property relief is available on shares in private limited companies that are trading companies, wholly or mainly trading companies. If it's an inactive company just sitting on cash, there's no inheritance tax relief, and therefore, yes, you do have a problem.
Well, we've got questions are coming through thick and fast in the form of 5. I don't think we expected that many, but moving on to Ashley's next one. I want to set up some kind of discretional trust, but struggle to find people I trust. Am I better off speaking to John for tax advice first, or James for a possible structure to run past him?
I think both of us together would be the honest answer, because that's the way you get the best advice. Unless John wants to disagree.
To be honest, in terms of it would come into one or other of us normally. Basically, James would probably advise to take tax planning. I would advise that they get it drawn up properly. If his issue is that he has nobody he trusts, then you can get professional trustees to manage the trust.
Just answering another question, Johnny, no, I did not get the blue shirt memo, nor did I check. But moving back into the serious questions, Jeremy, I suspect I know who Johnny is. Jeremy says that for many business owners, their partner is not involved in the day-to-day running of the business. So combining business succession planning with personal financial planning, which I agree is the best approach, can feel a bit of an awkward topic to raise around the dinner table. Any tips that don't verge into marriage guidance?
Is that my side, is it?
That is your, what marriage guidance? Yeah, that is your side.
I've been called a marriage counsellor a lot actually. I think it's just having an honest conversation about what you're looking to achieve. Often that's my job, and usually outsourcing that to someone like me, I think, is a bit easier, rather than say, broaching the topic over a nice dinner. So usually it's just having an honest conversation. Look, what are we trying to achieve? What are the things that are important to us as a family? Let's start there. Let's then put some goals on it. Let's put some, do you want to retire in 5 years' time? Do you want to pass assets to the kids? What do we think we want that to look like as a couple? Just having those simple but difficult conversations fairly early, and then the advice off the back of that becomes fairly simple for us. I don't know if John and James agree, but if we know what the drivers are, advising becomes a lot simpler.
Yeah, I think I'd add on there, is it depends what, say, the surviving spouse wants to achieve, because actually, if it is, well, my priority is to have an income and to ensure I have that income, the question I'd ask back is, well, would it be best placed for you to be a trustee or an executive? If you don't have that necessary business acumen, would you make the correct decisions? And the answer may be no. So then you say, well, actually, under the terms of the will, for example, or any trusts, we have appropriate people in place who will be able to act in the best interest of the company. And by acting in the best interest of the company or the business, you will get the income that you need for the rest of your life. So I think it's how it's phrased and how the different perspective of looking at it.
Because it's phrased around. Sorry, John.
No, sorry, just tend to find if you go into those conversations with, if we do X, we'll save Y tax, it tends to make sense quite quickly.
But of course, those conversations are had around the kitchen table because we can't have them around a restaurant table. And just
have a beach meeting around the restaurant table.
Oh, well, obviously, I'm not going to get into the tier discussion because that's something else entirely. I suppose just finish thinking about where we leave this. The elephant in the room, apart from death and taxes, obviously, is coronavirus. I mean, how are you guys, just each of you, if you wouldn't mind, just for a moment, is that having an impact on the way clients are thinking, the way we think it does? Has it accelerated things? Is there this sense of existential dread? What's your sense of the mood out there when it comes to having these kind of discussions?
Shall I go first?
Please do.
Mood is interesting. I think we were in mourning for about maybe 4 or 5 months was my instinct. People weren't sure what to do about it, and then I think the business community, from my perspective, bounced back quite well, which was great. And I think we're now looking at opportunity. So, I'm having a number of discussions about people that, maybe they had an exit plan 3, 4, 5 years ahead. They've now realised that they probably want that in the next couple of years. So I've got five transactions on my desk at the moment where we didn't expect to have offers for the business this quickly, but it's just accelerated their thinking to think, do I want to be doing this for the next 3, 5, 10 years? So from my perspective, I'm seeing a lot of business owners accelerate their thinking towards actually achieving their financial plan, which for me is great. I'm also seeing a couple of guys that are struggling with the businesses, but are getting through that phase and are coming out the other side. We're going to have casualties, but understanding what Plan B is, I think, is quite useful as well in the current environment.
How about you, John?
It's very much driving business as it happens. It is, because I deal with entrepreneurs and family-owned businesses. It is forcing people to be creative. It's forcing people to change direction. There are definitely the kinds of conversations Adam's been talking about. A lot of people believe I have dark art powers and foresight, and I'm questioned constantly of what's going to happen with capital gains tax. I have no idea. But that is driving people's thinking at the moment in terms of, if the rates are going to go up, do I need to plan now? So there's a lot of conversation, a lot of work, and a lot of the stamp duty holiday, for example, property's going mad. So whenever there is change, as I say, 2 constants, death and taxes. Taxes change. So it's driving business in my sector.
James, you have the last word. What do you think?
I think it's mixed. We get a lot of people coming to put things in place, but then also you can see people whose business may be struggling, where actually they decided to kick their personal planning into the long grass, which isn't ideal really, but completely understandable. But I think it goes back to Adam's point about the big circle and the small circle, and what's the priority. I agree again with Adam. There was the 5 months of mourning, but I'm hopeful now that with us hopefully coming through this, that we're going to people see the importance of looking after themselves and the family rather than looking after the business at the family's expense.
So we're going to wrap up now. As we would normally, we are 1 minute ahead of time. Adam, where can our audience find you? Where's the best place for them to get hold of you?
LinkedIn, or I'm on Twitter as well, but www.xentum.co.uk. I'm sure there'll be a follow-up with the recorded webinar. I'm pretty much on most social media apart from Instagram, which I can't stand.
John, how about you?
I'm on Instagram, but you can't get me for tax. You can get me at www.alexander.co.uk. There's an info at request form, and all tax queries are sent my way.
Fantastic. James, how about you?
I'm on LinkedIn and no other social media platforms, as I'm a Luddite. Aside from the BLM website, which is www.blmlaw.com.
Well, that's fantastic, guys. Thanks very much for your time. Everybody in the audience, thank you so much for joining us. We're delighted to have been able to have this discussion with you, and hopefully we'll talk to you again soon. Thanks, guys.
Cheers.